And thank you on behalf of the International Society for Quality of Life Studies for joining this webinar today. ISQOLS webinar, Age and Aging and Wellbeing, presented by Dr. Ellen Piper. I'll first introduce our moderators for this event, Anthony Lepentour and Parvis Dabir Alai. They are our ISQOLS Vice Presidents of Online Events, and they will be facilitating the question and answer period and serving as discussants for the session today. Now to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Ellen Piper is based in the economics department at the University of Leeds, having joined in 2022. Before then, he has worked for institutions in Germany and France, as well as the UK. Yeah. Age and well-being has been a long-standing interest of his, having been a focus of his PhD, which investigated the well-being of the young in Britain, which, if you have your microphone on, please mute. Thank you. Sorry, we'll go back to that. Having a focus in his PhD, which investigated the well-being of the young in Britain, which, as this presentation demonstrates, is very topical. Since then, he has published numerous articles on well-being in relation to contemporary issues, such as aging, gender gaps, migration, over-education, physical pain, and sleep. Just a quick reminder, if you are joining us as a participant, please turn off your video and your microphone as we give full attention to our speaker, Dr. Ellen Piper. Dr. Piper.
Great, thanks Jill, and thanks everybody. I'll get straight into it. So Jill designed this flyer for the presentation a couple of weeks ago, and when she sent me a couple of pictures taken at the ISQOLS conference earlier this year, I saw the photographs and then realized that actually maybe I do know something about aging and I have something to talk about in this presentation. A brief preamble about the presentation. It's not going to be a typical research presentation, which with one study in detail from start to finish. It's going to cover quite a lot of ground and sometimes lightly too. But there will be some new evidence regarding the debate between age and well-being. And after that, I'm going to move on to discuss why, after the evidence, which comes from specification curve analysis, I'll discuss why there are midlife struggles, what's been a key feature of age and aging and well-being. And then at the end, I will highlight alarming trends regarding the well-being of the young, which seems important and urgent at the moment. Okay, so before we start, I want to acknowledge co-authors. So I've done some work on this topic with quite a few other people. So I'm sure most of these people. So David Blanchflower, Alex Bryson, Kausik Chowdhury, Carol Graham, Gert Grudsinger, and Anthony Lepentour. Anthony, of course, is one of the moderators for today's session. Kausik, you might not know, but he's a colleague here at Leeds. And Gert Grudsinger was a former colleague when I worked in Flensburg in the north of Germany a few years ago. And yeah, all the usual caveat, of course, applies. All the interpretations are mine. I do know that some of my interpretations are not 100% the same as some of these other academics here. Yeah, and of course, all errors and so on are mine too. So yeah, there's been a long-running debate in empirical literature regarding age and well-being. When I've told a few people about this presentation, some people were shocked that there is still a debate about this, but there is, and we'll discuss that a little bit. And here's a quote from a paper this year, just saying that this debate about age and well-being in the literature is probably the most contentious within the well-being literature. Another quote here, the debate's sometimes been at cross purposes and perhaps needlessly confrontational. And there's good evidence for that claim too. And also, apart from just acknowledging the debate, some confusion about the nature of the relationship itself. This study actually tries to address that. So it's Kratz and Bruno, a working paper, and they're saying that there's a puzzling pattern of mixed empirical evidence and that social sciences seems unable to answer questions about the relationship between age and well-being. This is a little bit unfair, really, to social science. And it reflects a bit more the literature review here. So generally, or in the past, the majority finding for this age and well-being relationship has been a bit of a U-shape. Yeah, this is just for illustrative purposes, really, but this is US data, daily data about well-being. The red dots here are with controls, the blue dots are without controls. And then when a quadratic is used, then you have this kind of smooth path, really, for that. Another example here, which I'm showing you because of the two different curves here. So there is also evidence about differences for different groups. The green line here is about temporary employees, people with temporary contracts. And then the kind of orangey line here is about permanent employees with permanent contracts. And we do see that in midlife, 46, 48, 50, 52, and so on. So that gap between those two groups is quite big. Notably, they both have lower life satisfaction than earlier on. And that gap, further analysis shows only about 1/6 of that gap is about job security. But I'll come back to this idea later on about different groups having different trajectories when we try and talk about why. So this debate, this contentious debate, a big source of the debate is about the control set. There are some arguments for having no controls, apart from those needed to take into account period effects. These are made particularly by Glenn and more recently Bartram. And the general idea is that nothing comes before age, so no controls are needed. It's also summarized by Kratz and Brudel in their summary of the debate as well, that trying to define confounding variables is not straightforward with this debate, and that when we think about causality, no variable can have a causal effect on age because age cannot be manipulated. They carry on and say, well, that might mean that we don't need any controls or any confounders, but they argue that that's a pitfall. And they talk about sample composition here. An example that they give is migrant status. And the idea here is that if a data set has a lot of migrants in it, and if migrants are generally younger than non-migrants and generally less happy than non-migrants, then this analysis would show artificially an increase in well-being as people age, or that older people are happier than younger people. And they suggest more things to take into account for similar reasons. So for example, sex, social origin, and region of origin. There's also another way of approaching control variables, and this is the standard economist way, having a standard control set, which doesn't include health. And this control set is employed and the underlying relationship is sought out for analysis. Also important for the new evidence I'm going to show you, the response of Blanchard and Oswald to the challenge of Glenn about controls is that control variables are a matter of methodological judgment, and that they say that there's scope on this for reasonable people to disagree reasonably. Other aspects of the debate are whether it's a cross-sectional phenomenon or a longitudinal one too. Does it more affect cohorts or life cycle, but the functional form? We saw earlier that the quadratic bias can smooth out some of these things and artificially create this kind of U-shape. And the survey response, the findings from survey response literature, the idea that I'm going to address here, which is particularly important for age, is that when people are first in a panel, then they report higher well-being than at later points in the data set. This is particularly important for age because it would inflate the well-being of younger people responding more when they're younger than later. And also because a lot of people join the panel at 18, then it might artificially influence that increase in well-being at a young age. So that we're taking into account too. Before we get back to this, a bit of an interlude just to explain specification curve analysis, which is the method that I'll be using to talk about controls and the debate for the first 15 or so minutes of this presentation. So about 10 years ago, there were news headlines on many different websites, including Sky News, that female hurricanes are more deadly than the male. This is the idea that when a hurricane has a female name, then there are more fatalities from that. And the idea is that people were less likely to evacuate if a storm had a female name. So 2014, this was published, and then there were quickly lots of rebuttals and letters to the editor and responses from the original authors about this too. So here, a letter to the editor. I should also mention it's published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences too. Then a response to that, another letter to the editor, another letter to the editor, a response to those previous letters to the editors, another letter to the editor, and so on. So a big debate about this area. And the point here is that the debate here was about people making competing arguments about different methodological choices, a bit like age and well-being too. with the hurricane, the storm one, how to measure the gender of the name was one of the choices. Do we want to just have a dummy variable for that, or is it some kind of intensity? Are some names more female than other names? Discussions about outliers, leverage points, how to measure damages. Do we want to take into account whether it was a storm or a hurricane or not? And the model used, logs or negative binomials, and also different possibilities about interactions. So these letters to the editors and the responses were arguing about all of these, or making the case for quite a lot of these. And the specification curve analysis, the paper here is a very good introduction to specification curve analysis. And the idea here is, well, if these considerations are reasonable, then estimate different specifications that cover all of these possibilities, and then just show the results. And what's good about specification curve analysis is that there's no need to make a judgment about which one of these things that could vary is most appropriate or correct. Instead, just estimate and show everything. So here's the specification curve, and I'll explain it. We'll start at the top right-hand corner here. Hopefully you can see the mouse arrow. But the extra deaths here, this is for females. So we have this 0 line here where the deaths associated with hurricanes with a male name and a female name are the same. And as we go up here, then female hurricanes are associated with more deaths. This is ordered from the lowest coefficient size to the highest coefficient size. And here we have, this shows 300 specifications. In the paper itself, there are nearly 1,800 specifications, this hurricane example. And then what we see in the bottom panel here are all these dots, different colored dots, and these correspond to these different methodological choices here. So how do we want to take into account the feminine name, different interaction effects, functional forms, the model, the feminine name, and so on, and then leverage points, outliers. And then when we move along the specification curve, then these points just below do tell us that, okay, when a specification includes these factors here with the dots, then we get a coefficient of this amount here on the curve. The big black circle here is the original specification. The other dots that you can see on this blue line here are also statistically significant at a 95% confidence level. And we do see that most of those are not significant, they're blue. So the original authors, with their specification choice here, had a result that ended up having a significant coefficient for more deaths for females, for hurricanes with female names than male names. But it seems that that's quite rare. In the paper, with these near 1,800 specifications, it's just under 2% that are actually significant. Also, with the specification curve analysis, one good thing as well, we can actually try and see if there are trends with some of these choices and the curve. And one I want to point out here really is just that when this seems to go up here, this curve, so more and more deaths, that seems to be more consistently associated with a negative binomial model. So these points down here as well. Okay, so this is with my colleague Kaushik Chowdhury from Leeds, and our solution is similar. We're going to vary the choices and show everything. It is ongoing work, but there's enough to show you at the moment anyway, and it will develop. So we use both the BHPS Understanding Society and the German Socioeconomic Panel. Sometimes the BHPS Understanding Society is harmonized and sometimes not, which makes a big difference to the sample. These, of course, common data sets used to analyze well-being, and we allow the control sets to vary, sometimes take into account individual fixed effects and sometimes not. We also use the Duray and Alessi Social Science and Medicine paper correction to take into account cohort effects, and also have a dummy variable for that first appearance in the sample for every specification. And how we treat age is, so we're avoiding the quadratic bias, and we split an 18 to 70 sample age range into 18 to 50 and 51 to 70, and then treat as linear, and find out what the linear line is for those two age ranges. And we will move on to vary this choice too. Post 70 is often a decline in age with our specification curves too, And this is something that's been known since at least Christoph Funder and colleagues, co-authors, a good decade ago. Why split at 50 is a good question, and this reflects the past literature generally showing this kind of U-shaped pattern, or this midlife low kind of pattern, and it's a test of that. If 18 to 50 the coefficient is negative, then well-being is going down to 50, and then 51 to 70, if it is reflecting this kind of a midlife low period, then it'll be going up from 51 to 70. And also the data itself does suggest a turning point around then. So for the UK, these are all fixed effects with different controls here, including none. And an average inflection point here is 48.8. So this is the nadir in well-being, so the lowest point for well-being. So in the UK, just under 49, and in Germany with these data sets, then 51. So these are our results. Also ongoing is our us trying to make the diagrams nicer. It's a bit tricky, but we're working on that too. But I can explain it here. So the dashed line at the top is 0. So this would be, of course, no relationship between age and well-being between 18 to 50. The left graph, as you might be able to see, it might be difficult, is UK. On the right, it's Germany. And then, as with the hurricanes example, then the green dots here are about varying the control set, which does include a baseline of no controls. And then at the bottom, whether we include individual fixed effects or not. And the important point for this diagram here is every one of these dots here is below the 0 line for the UK and Germany. Again, ordered by the coefficient size. So whether it's UK and Germany, we do see that age, linear age between 18 to 50 is negative for life satisfaction. Quite interesting for the UK, and when we come to 5170, quite interesting too. So we can look at the panel below and try and spot patterns. And these points here towards the right of the UK diagram seem to be associated with these points here, and this is not including fixed effects. So it seems to be that when fixed effects is included here, which reflects aging, that kind of within change, then the coefficient here is more negative than when it's not included here. So there is a difference between aging and then that taken into account between variation as well here. 51 to 70, we are also getting what we expect here. So the 0 line is now down here, and then all of these coefficients, all from the last slide and this slide too, are statistically significant at a 99% confidence level here. And again, we see it's all positive. And the ones again for the UK and for Germany this time here, these ones towards the right, the higher coefficients, then again, these are associated with no control for fixed effects. So this is more the aging kind of effect, and these are more the between variables effect. There's more work to do here, and it seems that if we look at the green dots, there probably are some patterns here, but they're quite hard to discern, particularly compared to the inclusion or the exclusion of fixed effects in this analysis too. Also, the Dorea and NSE correction results are not on those diagrams just because the equation to estimate them is quite different, but the results are fully supportive of the previous findings. And also, this method allows figures to be produced that show that relationship between age and well-being after taking into account cohort effects. This method's always always a panel, always includes individual fixed effects. So these diagrams that you're going to see are life cycle or aging profiles without cohort influence, just like in the original article. So I'm just going to show you the UK because of time. And we see here, so we see this kind of general pattern. These diagrams are different based on the control set. So here, no controls, and then income and employment, and so on. And one thing I want to point out here is this kind of little increase here towards, this little increase here with age in the first diagram. And so towards 30, it just seems to increase a little bit. And on all the top row, that seems to happen. Bottom left seems to happen too. And then bottom in the middle, it seems to flatten out and flatten out again, bottom right. And the difference between the four where it's going up a little bit and where it's flat seems to be the inclusion of marital status. So this kind of increase that we're seeing earlier is about, seems to be about happy young people being married. And then when that's controlled for, then it's flatter too. By actually by doing things like this and varying the control sets rather than having an opinion about control sets and sticking to it, it does enable us to have an idea about what kind of people are happier and when. Just one example here. That bump's not new, it's been noted before. So this excellent paper here, Economic Journal, Cheng et al., super paper. In the debate, it's not really mentioned. It's great longitudinal evidence of a midlife low or a midlife nadir, the title of the paper. And yeah, it's just a really good paper. And in the note in that paper, there's a comment that Richard Eastlin had spotted the 30 pattern too, and also suggested that a more nuanced interpretation of the life cycle pattern is desirable. Yeah, I agree with that. And that there is an uptick at around 30. The previous slide that you saw seems to suggest that uptick might reflect marital status or happy young people who are married. In the original paper, the Direct LSE, there's also, in their trended age profile, there's also a U-shape between 30 and 70 too. So a brief summary, that specification curve analysis, it is ongoing, but finds evidence for a midlife low, well-being going down to 50, and then up to 70, supporting much previous work while cutting through that debate. Given the nature of that debate, the contentiousness I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to note that these results apply to two data sets, very good data sets, but only two data sets during a specific point in time, so from the mid-90s to just a few years ago. And they indicate average findings, so average effects. Doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will follow that pattern, of course. And that will be discussed pretty soon too. In general, the debate about the pattern it is a bit of a confection, really. Like, for example, the Cheng paper being not really being discussed, and there are other reasons for that too. And I think that debate is not as interesting as why we find this pattern. Why does it exist? And I'm going to share some ideas, some research and some ideas about why now too. So yeah, there's some previous work investigating why. So one reason has been biology, very famous study. Andrew Oswald and an interdisciplinary team looked at apes. And there's some other evidence, some neurobiological evidence or arguments from neurobiology, and perhaps sleep studies too. This slide here, this is a presentation at the Be Well conference, which I'll mention very briefly soon, and a member of the audience, someone who I first met at an ISQOLS conference in 2017, and has since become a really good friend, took this photograph and thought that it was a good example of shared biology between humans and apes. And the idea for this biology argument is that, or perhaps some of the reasons because we share similar biology as apes, and there's some evidence for apes having a midlife crisis. They may be universal. Maybe there isn't much that we can do about it. And the person that took the photograph wanted credit. I don't know if she's joking or not, but here it is. And then just a brief mention of Be Well, which is a really good little network, wellbeing researchers. And I think there is a call for papers out at the moment for the 2025 meeting. Yes, a very early argument from psychology about this, about it being perhaps universal. Each of us goes through it in his or her own way, experiences it with greater or lesser intensity, and emerges from it more or less reconciled to the years ahead. It's a natural developmental crisis, and it's unavoidable. This will be discussed a bit further, but as an aside, this was actually written by a guy called Murray Stein, and he wrote the foreword to this book, which is where it comes from, and he's still alive. So I tried to work out how old he was when he wrote this, and he was 24, which amuses me. I don't think about midlife at that age. And and also, so biology and this quote and other arguments seem to suggest that it might be universal, but it might be that some people avoid it. I'm going to offer some speculation about some people that might avoid midlife low in a bit. Yeah, and again, just a reminder that these are those so far average effects, and if we want to understand why, we shouldn't really get too wedded to those average effects. Individual differences are important and interesting, and I'm going to move on to discuss some of those. So you saw that figure earlier about permanently employed and temporarily employed. There's also research from Andrew Clark and co-authors, John Helliwell and co-authors that look at other groups too. The ones in bold are the ones that have all of these people experience on average this kind of midlife low, but for the bold people, it's not as deep as for the group that are not bold font, bold text. So the permanently employed have a better midlife than those in temporary employment, the partnered against the non-partnered, and at work, if the boss is quite inclusive and like a partner rather than being authoritarian, and living in the same community for 15 years against less than 15 years. We'll come back to talking about this and why quite soon. Yeah, a brief from the temporary employment. It was inspired a little bit by working in Germany as well, and just a bit of solidarity to young researchers in Germany and elsewhere. Ich bin Hannah. So this is from the Andrew Clark et al. Article here, and we do so. Gender here is very similar between males and females, as it is in some other studies. And here we see a big difference between those with a partner, the top two lines, and without a partner. And we see that in midlife, it's still a bit lower than earlier on, but not by so much, and quite a bit lower for the non-partnered in midlife. And also, these are average effects too. And my speculation about people avoiding midlife low is, even if there may be biological tendencies or other arguments for it that might suggest that we all at least have tendencies towards that, it might be that it probably is that people who have great relationships in midlife maybe avoid a midlife low completely, that it more than compensates for any possible tendency from biology. It's possible. I've looked at that very briefly with the SERP, looking at family satisfaction, but of course it's challenging to do accurately for quite a few reasons that I'm sure you know about. Endogeneity and so on. So my suggestion here is that perhaps those with excellent partnerships do avoid a midlife low. So there's different trajectories. Just a reminder that permanent employment contract is better than temporary employment. Partnered better than non-partnered. At work, a more inclusive boss rather than one that's a bit more authoritarian or hierarchical, and living in the same community for 15 years. And it's interesting to think about what these findings might indicate. I'm going to pause, drink a little bit of water, and carry on. And encourage you to type any suggestions that you may have about this in the chat. So whether it's about a particular one of these things or all of them together, which is quite interesting. What might these have in common that mean that midlife is not as bad for one group compared to the other group? I can't see the chat at all, but hopefully you'll indulge me and write down a suggestion or two. Okay, moving on, my suggestion for this is that it might be about belonging, but perhaps that people who have a temporary contract, people who are not partnered, people who don't have an inclusive environment at work, haven't lived in the same neighborhood for a long time, maybe they have a lower sense of belonging than the other groups. And psychologists, psychotherapists assert that we learn about belonging in childhood. That childhood tells us how much our parents and upbringing demonstrate to us how safe the world is, how much we can trust the world, how secure we feel. And this can have a long shadow affecting well-being in adulthood. And it can also affect how good we are at forming relationships and settling and having good partnerships and so on too. Very brief note about causality here. So in the employment contract study that I showed you earlier, then some evidence that temporary employment actually led to lower life satisfaction. But this doesn't really address the issue about childhood having an impact because, of course, That data was from the SERP, the German Socioeconomic Panel, and child obviously predates that. So selection into temporary employment or selection into these kind of non-partnership groups, non-belonging groups can't be ruled out. Another question for you to engage with in the chat. So this is from an introduction to psychotherapy, a book, and I want you to try and guess the publication age. So hopefully in the chat you'll write down when you think this was from. But these are a couple of quotes from I think page 164, 165. So the book's not about midlife or aging at all. It's just a few statements, very matter-of-fact statements actually in a book. But this midlife is a very definite moment in life. It's a point at which many normal people fall ill and come to us for help. Psychotherapists is us. And also the depression of the middle age is something we frequently see in our consulting rooms among people otherwise normal. So I want you to type what year you think the book was published, and I will give some clues. So my first clue is that this predates the empirical revolution and the ISQOLS formation. A little reminder about ISQOLS' formation here, that next year will be 30 years. And a little plug here for the conference in Luxembourg next year. Always a good occasion. It also predates Elliot Jax's coinage of the midlife crisis term, which was at a conference in 1957 in London, and the article Death and the Midlife Crisis was published in 1965. And a big clue is that it predates just about the Second World War. So this book was actually published in 1938. And what was astonishing to me when I found this was just how it was written. I mentioned it just. It's very matter of fact, totally unlike the debate now. It's just kind of accepted as a fact, and this just happens. Some of the ideas from William Brown in this book do match some of the ideas what Elliot Jax thinks about this too. Moving on a bit to what the midlife slump is and why. So psychotherapists have long discussed this and say in midlife that our well-being declines to midlife, where we flounder amid ordinariness in the sour leaves of midlife. And they've tried to say why, and I'm going to give you a very brief summary of this now. So yes, there's many different ways of characterizing this kind of midlife slump, this feeling. So here are some of them. A creeping dissatisfaction with our lives in midlife, a sense of being a bit lost, of life not being quite what was expected. And in this literature, other literatures and popular culture, there are lots of different ways and examples of this, of it being expressed and displayed. So why? Again, this literature, the psychotherapeutic literature, or literature from psychotherapists, suggests that midlife's often argued to be a difficult developmental liminal period, just separating us, or even moving us, or the unhappiness in this period, moving us between the first half of life and the second half of life, or adulthood. And just very briefly, in the first half of adulthood, we're meant to be pursuing ego goals, which is not a bad thing. So trying to establish ourselves in a career, a family, a household, and so on. And our focus is meant to be more external. And that we're also following scripts, or the arguments made are that we're following scripts given to us by society. So it might not be something that's personal and individually meaningful to us, but it's something that we've taken on from society. And also in childhood, that we form behaviors in childhood, school, at home, that are adaptive to our situation. And then in adulthood, these adaptive ways of behaving become maladaptive. And midlife is the idea of trying to kind of address this. And second half of life, rather than follow these ego goals or what society tells us we should be following, that we're argued to benefit more by pursuing more emotionally meaningful goals, things that are more personal to us and more individual. So something maybe a bit more thoughtful. A brief note here about the kind of the meaning of happiness. A pretty good study from a few years ago that said that younger people define happiness as kind of excitement and newness, and that older people describe it more as peace of mind, being content as well. Maybe perhaps reflecting these kind of changes too. Also, there's also an argument that it's actually evolutionary too.
Alan, just to let you know that you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anthony. So very briefly, because I really do want to end on the young people. So very briefly here, then the evolutionary argument is that society needs both the young and the old. The young with their energy, audacity, and impetuousness. It's kind of to have great big goals that maybe somebody older would think is unrealistic or would know is unrealistic, but to go for it anyway. And the wisdom, experience, moderation, foresight. I would also add compassion of people who are older too. The society needs both, and that midlife, this kind of midlife unhappiness, is trying to encourage people to make changes and move from one to the other, and it can take time. Carl Jung said that this change is formed on the anvil of crisis, and his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, describes really a midlife crisis or something very similar to what we might think of as a typical midlife crisis in his life. And that was between 1914 and 1917, so again, a long time ago. And the evolutionary argument is that people who were once young, energy, audacity, boldness, eventually become capable of wise, individuated eldership in society. Very briefly, just a summary of some of this thought here is a subtitle of another book dealing with aging and midlife and beyond. From Role to Soul, which also summarizes this kind of first half of adulthood life to the second half of adulthood life too. There's a lot more written about that. This is a very brief summary, 5-10 minutes in a presentation. And if you do want to read much more about this, much more really, the latest ISQOLS working paper is a non-empirical discussion of all of these different arguments. So it mentions belonging, childhood a little bit, and lots about personal development and Erik Erikson and so on, development stages, and also quite a lot about the psychotherapeutic literature. At the end of this as well, there are at least 20 research questions developed, quite a lot of which have never been investigated before, as far as I know. Some have, where it's possible to help us understand more about midlife and why does this phenomenon of midlife slump happen. Okay, great. This is the last bit, and we're probably maybe 2 or 3 minutes away from the end. So I just want to end by talking about the well-being of the young. There's often been frequent and varied arguments for young people's struggles. Here's some from earlier this century. So there's a report called the iPod generation, and that stands for insecure, pressured, overtaxed, and depressed. Also, the jilted generation. This book's from 2010, and and I had a look at it in my office just before this presentation, and there are graphs in there about UK house prices. It's generally about policy, housing particularly, and as many people may know in the UK, then the house prices have just got worse and worse now. So the arguments made then still apply. Those iPod generation, jilted generation arguments are more objective, and there were arguments like quarter life crisis. I've not heard much about this lately, but this is a bit more subjective. Decided that life has not turned out to be what it should be for younger people. Kind of clash of expectations and reality. The data, when these were published, suggested that these struggles were probably related to declining well-being. The idea that we have this very approximate U-shape where well-being falls for young people. And it might reflect people sliding down this view. But now things seem quite different. This diagram that you can see here is about suicide rates for people in the US between 15 to 24. The scales are quite different, but we see, blue is female. Moving along from the left, so 2001 to about 2010, it's fairly flat, some ups and downs, and then from about 2010, then these rates, rapidly increase. So the female one, in case you can't see the scale, it's probably about a 50% increase. And for the male rate here, it's about a third, so about 33% increase. And there are lots of statistics like this. A brief note that in general, females seem to be suffering more than males in this period. Both are suffering a lot compared to the past, and females seem to be suffering quite a bit more than they were in the past too. The green bars here are young females, the blue bars are young males, and yeah, in most countries, females are reporting more long-standing illnesses and health problems. As mentioned, there's much more evidence, and it's pretty alarming. For example, studies showing increased incidences of feelings of anxiety and depression, GAD-7, PHQ-9, and studies of COVID data. I'm one of the co-authors of this particular study, along with Anthony, one of our moderators here, that data is showing that there are also issues of well-being. It's not just ill-being, there are also well-being issues of younger people really struggling then. That's generally argued to be the way that governments have combated the pandemic has been particularly harmful for the well-being of young people. And yeah, as a very brief, quick summary because of time, 2011, 2012 are the years most cited for this kind of ill-being turn for young people, exacerbated by COVID, particularly prevalent for young females. And there's much work by Jonathan Haid and Jean Twenge. And their co-authors do lots of work. Some of the reasons put forward are screen time, social media, the clash of expectations and reality. I mentioned that earlier too. And I've added this because I think, more research is needed basically. And so also the socioeconomic, political, and environmental climate that we all face might be particularly pressing for young people. Conclusion. So last main slide. So this trend is alarming and it needs addressing. While midlife does seem kind of perennial, with that book from 1938, Carl Jung, I know an anecdote, but Carl Jung's example from over 100 years ago, it seems quite individual, maybe a bit personal, perhaps even an arguably necessary, important development period too. And this means that it might be amenable to policy, but it might be quite difficult to do that if there's different solutions for different people. And maybe it is something that we need to go through, or the society needs us to go through, that evolutionary arguments. But that compared to what's happening with young people at the moment, since about 2010, 2011, this is cohort-based. It seems societal. It seems perhaps technological too. And it seems really urgent to address. And because it is cohort-based, because it is societal, not inverted commas natural, one of the quotes that we saw earlier, then it's likely quite a bit more amenable to policy action. But this really needs to happen now. Young people's well-being seems to be in a bit of a crisis. There we go. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. We're perfect. Yes, we're perfectly on time. So thank you very much. I guess I'm here like in multiple screens. Yeah. So thank you very much. It was really like a great presentation, very clear, and it's nice also to have this sort of overview because as you mentioned, we have been talking and working together for years. So it's great to see this, overview, putting literature together in a way that makes a lot of sense. So thank you very much for this effort.
So I'm delighted. I've just seen that there are 42 messages in the chat. So I'm delighted people have answered some of those.
That's exactly what I was going to tell you. Since we know each other very much, I don't want to take too much of the time from the the audience. So I will invite the audience to raise your virtual hand if you have questions. And Alan, I'm just going to read you two first questions, and then I will move to the audience. So first, there's a question from Anje asking you, was the definition of middle age in 1938 the same as it is today? Question one. Question two, you have a question coming from Ralitza. Would household composition and or agency in terms of decision-making in one's household play a role? So let's hear maybe your opinion about this, and then we will move to...
Yeah, so my memory from that book, so I don't know really, I only can comment on that book. I'm not a historian, but I think it would be interesting to know much about the history of this phenomenon. Is that mid-40s is mentioned in the book, but I'm not sure. My memory as someone deep in middle age is not great. But I suspect, I think I've read mid-40s somewhere, but I can easily find that out. I know the page numbers and so on. Yeah. And can you remind me about the second question briefly?
About the
As an example of my bad memory.
No worries. It's about the household composition and the agency in terms of decision making. How does that play a role in moderating the effect of age?
I don't know. And I don't know of any work that does. It may exist, but I've not read it. One thing that's quite so one of the arguments about midlife, particularly maybe this is a bit relevant, is about generativity or stagnation. And no. I was trying to link it, but yeah, I don't know. It's a good question, and
no, fair enough.
For someone.
David, I see that you rose your hand first.
Okay, thanks, Alan. That was really interesting. The specification curve idea, that's fascinating. I hadn't seen that before. I'm entirely convinced about the idea of a midlife low in Britain and Germany. What concerns me more is the idea that it's universal. And so then I start to wonder what happens to the various arguments that you've offered that you say you want to explore. I mean, that those arguments, I think, their relevance relies on the idea that the midlife low is in fact universal. So if it's not universal, what do we do?
So these are average effects, and the arguments that they are universal are the more biological ones. And if it is, so if some of the arguments, if psychotherapists are correct, I'm not saying they are, but if their arguments are correct, that it is an important phase in life, then, and it's moving people from being young and bold and energetic to being more kind of caretakers of society in a way, then that would apply to, there's no reason to say that wouldn't apply to many different societies and be a bit more universal. But some of the other arguments, maybe not. So I'm not making a claim that it's universal at all. There are some arguments that suggest it might be, that might be tendencies towards that. But I think there's a paper last week, which I've not properly read yet, using data from parts of the developing world, and I think that was quite a mixed picture. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but that seems quite interesting too.
Yeah. So what I have in mind is mostly within Europe, and what is clear to me is that life satisfaction declines, happiness declines across the life course, especially in Eastern and Southern Europe. So the idea of a midlife low relies on the notion that after midlife it increases, and what I'm seeing is that in quite a lot of societies it just doesn't.
I think a lot of the so the papers that I've read are just a bit different to that. Maybe you can send me some. That kind of that uptick, it's different, seems to be different for different countries. Like we saw in the graphs earlier that Germany, and this is not just the results from specification curve analysis, generally it seems about 55 to 65 and then it fades again. Whereas the UK, perhaps because of a more encouraging political climate, but older people there, who knows about today's budget. I don't, because I was getting ready for this. But not universal, but some of those arguments would apply to all of these different places too. And actually, one comment about that, I think this just because there might be this natural tendency, inverted commas, natural, again, copying that quote, from my reading about it, people have got to work at it to actually be able to enjoy later life too. A bit of acceptance about the changes that we face. And it's effort. It's effort. Again, this is probably a better way that generativity and stagnation argument from Erik Erikson comes in, that it's not, that this isn't guaranteed for everybody, and people do have to work at it. Yeah. But about some of the studies that you've mentioned, I've obviously seen different ones or not seen them. But yeah, please do send on. Good comments.
Thank you, Alan. Marita, would you mind unmuting yourself? You're muted.
Still muted.
Thanks very much for the presentation. It was really very interesting. I come from Argentina. I follow the data in Latin America quite a lot and also worldwide. And I find it very interesting what you're saying of middle life. We see that a lot in our country, definitely. In all levels, every time we ask about it. And also the trend is kind of new, but we find the young people also coming down in happiness. And this is a great worry. And we follow a lot emotions. And we see that, as you said, depression, anxiety, they feel even lonely quite a lot. And so you stated that there were societal motives that I can better understand. But do you have more information on the technological issue? How it's working? How is technology influencing the way we communicate and in this case, this type of the way we are relating is good or bad for our happiness?
Yeah, I'm definitely no expert in this. I'm one of the investigators of this kind of topic, really. But the broad idea is maybe the way we're communicating a little bit. Yeah, I've not read much about that really, but a bit linked to that, cyberbullying is like communicating in that way. Cyberbullying, quite negative. But one of the things with with social media, like technologically, is this kind of social media. That it's also not just the general arguments about what we what we're exposed to, or what young people are exposed to, these kind of ideals of beauty and so on, and what life should be like, and the clash of like those unhelpful comparisons that are much more prevalent with technology, but also the fact that younger people can, because there are some arguments about whether it might even be just less of a stigma these days to actually, I suffer from anxiety or I have depression. And maybe people are reporting more than they would have done in the past, and that's influencing the data. There are some arguments against that, but also social media is where people do get exposed to information about this too. So it's complicated. It's it's not a great.
And maybe Alan, as a follow-up on this, if I may, like in the paper Alan and I are working on together, we see that screen time, and then screen time is a big black box, is associated with worth, mental health, and worth, life satisfaction. But the gradient changes with age. The younger you are, the more spending time in front of the screen is bad for your mental health and for your life satisfaction. So there is definitely something, even beyond the time, there is something about the content. Then what is it exactly? Then I think, I'm not sure economists should respond to this question, but we have empirical evidence on this. Lucas?
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, I think, very relevant topic. And I was wondering, I think I guess you controlled for health also. I didn't see it in the graphs.
No, health is generally explicitly not controlled for, not just in my estimate, but in many people's.
Okay. Then I was otherwise I was just wondering, maybe there are different effects on people with part-time or full-time job. I don't know if there are papers on this or if you are aware of it. I mean, I was wondering, for example, is these effects also due to the working life in like a Western working life, or is it different maybe in other cultures? But I guess this is hard to find out, maybe due to data. I don't know.
I think that's a really interesting idea. I've not read anything about that, but based on even just on today's slides, you could make a case or like a hypothesis that full-time is going to be more positive for these younger people. Bold ambition, set themselves up in society, career ladder, and so on. And then maybe for older people, maybe people are part. There could be an age relationship with that, and that older people working part-time might be happier than full-time.
Yeah, or otherwise.
Or otherwise, yeah. I think some of the general arguments about that part-time work for older people would, again, ceteris paribus, give them more time to try and pursue things that are more important to them, that aren't about career or having to build wealth and so on too. Yeah, so it's very interesting. I'm not aware of work like that, but it's really interesting. And if or when I do revise the working paper, then I might add that as a research question. Cheers, Lucas.
That's exactly what we want out of this kind of conversation. I see that there is a question from Monica, and based on the time we have left, this is going to be the last question.
And yes, and this is really a very brief question. Why don't we control for health?
Because in standard regressions, then it's the basic idea is, so this has been articulated much better by, for quite a long time. But in a basic regression, when you have people who are 18, 19, 20, and then people who are 70 and sometimes older, then it's assuming that their good health is the same, basically, and it might not be.
Well, it's clear that health is one of the most consistent predictors of subjective well-being, right?
It's important. Yeah, it's definitely important. Yeah.
I mean, what I have seen, particularly in aging research, so the argument for not controlling for it is because it's already part of age, or what is it?
Not really. I'm not articulating this very well. I could point to a particular quote straight away. It's basically the idea, if you want to make comparisons about well-being at different ages, then by controlling for health, then it's kind of artificially kind of assuming that the older and the younger have, maybe Anthony can help me out here a little bit, that you're controlling for health. So I'm just distracted now by a comment.
Well, the question that I have is, for example, if a 70-year-old, right, is still in very good health, and most of them are, right, particularly with higher socioeconomic status, then you would think, sure, they are, their well-being is high, but if they are not, if their health is actually problematic, the well-being might be low. So anyway, it's just curious to me that you don't control for health.
I think that'd be the same for younger people too. And it might be that older people have a different idea about what good health is than younger people. There might be some kind of...
It's still true that subjective health is one of the strongest predictors of subjective well-being. So not controlling for that is kind, and particularly in old age, right? But I also think in earlier ages. So it's, well, anyway,
if I may, Monica and Alan, on this,
it's kind of curious.
But it's basically, it depends on what is your research question. Actually, if your objective is to assess what is the total effect of age, then you don't want to control for health. You don't want to control for anything. And I guess David would join me on this. You don't want to control for anything because these are what we would call in economics and in econometrics bad controls. You are shutting down the channel. So then if you put a lot of controls, then you are going to end up with, I don't know, like the psychological, biological effect of age. But if you put some controls, then you start getting rid of the effect of age. And if your research question is, what is the effect of age? Then why would you shut down its effect? However, what you can do is to control for health after and say, look, the pattern I had of age can be explained by a pattern of changing health, by a pattern of changing family. So that's why I think usually we start with nothing, no control. Yeah. But then what's also super interesting is that Alan showed us that even when you actually put a lot of controls, you still get the same qualitatively, right? Yeah. You still find this, but the magnitude changes, which means that they are the channels like health does matter eventually. But usually that's sort of train of thought behind it.
Yeah, it's that the answer also might be just disciplinary a little bit. Yeah. Economics tends to have the way that I tried to explain, but being too tired and middle-aged after the presentation to get it out properly. But yeah, great. And if you'd like to know the quote and so on, the formal argument, then feel free to send me an email and I will send you a link to the paper and where it is as well.
And if I remember correctly, also this presentation will be available online. So if ever you want some of the material that Alan quoted, then you will be able to see it in the recording. Right, Jill?
Exactly. A great time for me to say thank you to everyone for participating Obviously, we could continue this conversation for a long, long time, but a reminder that we will be sending an email to everyone who registered soon with the recording and a link to Dr. Piper's working paper that's now published on our ISQOLS website. We will post all of the presenter materials in our members only forum. So we invite you to consider joining us as a member, and please participate in any of our upcoming events focusing on happiness, well-being, and quality of life research. Of course, you can find out more information about us on our website, isqols.org. With that said, I'm so sorry to cut the conversation short. I know we have a lot more to discuss on the topic, but due to time, we do have to end the webinar. I'll say thank you to our participants. Thank you everyone for participating in this webinar today, for your comments and your questions. To Anthony for moderating the Q&A, I appreciate that as well. And Dr. Piper, thank you so much. Your perspective on this important topic was enlightening, certainly a topic that deserves more attention. We hope you consider participating or presenting any future research again with ISQOLS in the future. Thank you again for your valuable contributions and for your time today. On behalf of ISQOLS, to everyone, we'll say, take care, be well, and we'll hope to see you in a future event. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.